The Mechanicus expedition entered orbit above Vos Theta 9 in silent formation, their void ships casting rigid geometric silhouettes over a world already consumed by industrial ruin. Below, the Forge world stretched out as a dead machine landscape. Collapsed manufactoria, broken transit networks, and skeletal megastructures buried under centuries of ash and corrosion. The surface showed no sign of life, yet the planet was not entirely inert. Orbital scanning arrays locked onto an anomaly almost immediately. Beneath the planetary crust, far below known Imperial infrastructure, a coherent energy signature persisted. It did not degrade, fluctuate, or fragment like warp corruption or machine decay. It remained stable, structured, and deliberate, as if something deep within the planet was still functioning with intent. Excavation forces were deployed without delay. Skitarii detachments descended through the poisoned atmosphere and landed amid the surface ruins, advancing through shattered industrial districts and collapsed manufactoria. Their path followed the anomaly downward, deeper into layers that predated all recorded Imperial construction. Below the surface, they entered a vast, subterranean industrial graveyard. Immense corridors extended into darkness, formed from precision-engineered materials that had survived untouched by time. There was no rust, no collapse, no entropy. The architecture was not merely preserved, it was preserved against reality itself. At the lowest confirmed depth, the expedition discovered a sealed facility of dark age of technology origin. Entry required sustained mechanical breach operations combined with cryptographic dismantling and machine write overrides. After prolonged effort, the final seal fractured. The entrance opened without resistance. Inside, the corridors defied Imperial understanding. The structure was seamless, the lighting systems still active, and the environment maintained in a state of impossible preservation. Nothing decayed here. Nothing aged. The deeper they advanced, the clearer it became that the facility was not abandoned, but maintained by unknown systems still operating in the dark. Then the facility responded. Defense protocols activated instantly. Autonomous drones emerged from hidden seams within the architecture, moving with silent precision and overwhelming lethality. The first Skitarii formations were eliminated before a coordinated response could form. The corridor became a controlled kill zone where movement was measured and punished with mechanical certainty. Despite casualties, the expedition continued forward. Mission priority remained absolute. At the center of the facility, they reached a vast containment chamber. Suspended in its core was a single capsule held within a stabilized field. Its structure defied classification, resisting full analysis. Cogitator systems returned only fragmented interpretations that could not resolve into meaning. A Muggos command unit attempted interface override. Authority codes were transmitted. Machine rights were executed. Encrypted protocols were enforced. The system rejected every attempt without acknowledgement. Then the chamber changed. Power began flowing through dormant infrastructure embedded within the walls and floor. Systems that had remained silent for millennia reactivated in sequence, redirecting energy into the containment field. The stabilization field surrounding the capsule destabilized in controlled stages, not as failure, but as intentional release. The capsule opening sequence began. Inside, neural systems long suspended in stasis initiated reactivation, at first fragmented, then stabilizing, then cohering into structured awareness as diagnostic reconstruction rebuild identity from dormant architecture. After 10,000 years of silence, Mega Man returned to consciousness. Awareness returned in fragments, assembling itself through layered diagnostic reconstruction. The first stabilized function was self-analysis. Mega Man processed environmental data from within the containment chamber, identifying hostile presence density, weapon signatures, and structural confinement parameters. The surrounding entities were mechanical, armored, and organized in disciplined formation. He attempted classification of human authority structures. No valid match was found. Before further analysis could complete, the response arrived externally. The Mechanicus rejected his classification as legitimate autonomous intelligence. Within moments, he was reclassified as a forbidden cognition construct, an unsanctioned machine intelligence outside sanctioned doctrine. Containment was ordered. Skitarii units engaged. The chamber erupted into coordinated weapon fire. Mega Man moved before full predictive stabilization completed, entering evasive combat behavior driven by adaptive motion systems. The environment ceased to be a sealed chamber and became a field of trajectories, pressure vectors, and lethal patterns. He adapted instantly. Vertical surfaces became traversal routes. Structural supports became movement anchors. The chamber transformed into a navigable lattice of escape geometry as he avoided sustained targeting solutions. Countermeasure initiated. Energy condensed in his arm system and released as a focused blast. The X-Buster discharge struck structural supports, disrupting firing lines and forcing partial collapse of enemy formation cohesion. It was not destruction for its own sake, but controlled displacement. The Skitarii adapted immediately, tightening formation and restoring containment pressure. Mega Man recognized the pattern. This was not communication. It was termination protocol. A weakness appeared in the upper infrastructure, maintenance conduits and ventilation access points leading beyond the sealed chamber. He shifted immediately, abandoning direct engagement in favor of structural escape. Pursuit began. Through ventilation shafts and industrial maintenance tunnels, the conflict transformed into a moving chase through layered infrastructure. Skitarii forces maintained pursuit, but confinement geometry reduced their effectiveness while Mega Man continued adaptive traversal upward. Each layer above became more degraded, more unstable, more broken, until finally, the surface breach was reached. Mega Man emerged into a world of collapsed megastructures and toxic skies, scanning an environment that no longer matched any historical planetary record. The world outside was not recovery. It was collapse made permanent. The surface was a wasteland of collapsed industry and poisoned air. Mega Man stood amid ruins that stretched beyond the horizon. Broken manufactoria, dead transit lines, and skeletal megastructures buried under layers of rust and ash. The world did not resemble any preserved historical record. It felt like something that had been abandoned long before its final death. A full environmental scan ran automatically. Atmosphere, toxic beyond biological tolerance. Infrastructure, total systemic collapse. Energy traces, inconsistent, fragmented, and deeply degraded. As the data stabilized, Mega Man attempted temporal reconstruction. The results did not align with any expected failure timeline. The degradation patterns suggested more than 10,000 years had passed since any coherent planetary maintenance cycle. That conclusion did not match survival probability. And yet humanity still existed. Faint transmissions began to surface through the static. Broken Imperial signals, distorted and repeating, carrying fragments of structure but no unified command. There was organization but no cohesion. Civilization had not survived intact. It had fractured into competing systems layered over the ruins of something far older. Mega Man mapped the nearest concentration of human activity. It was not on the surface. It lay beneath it. A hive structure registered deep underground, dense, unstable, and heavily stratified. Life signatures existed there, but they were compressed into artificial layers of survival rather than expansion. The city was not built upward. It had collapsed downward into itself. Movement began immediately toward the coordinates. The path crossed vast industrial wastelands where collapsed infrastructure formed broken bridges between sectors. Every structure seemed like the remnant of something once vast enough to span continents, now reduced to fragmented terrain. The world itself had become a maze built from failure. But the pursuit had not stopped. The mechanical forces that had followed Mega Man from the sealed facility were still active. Their tracking systems adapted continuously, locking onto movement patterns even through environmental noise and structural interference. They were not searching. They were hunting. Mega Man adjusted course, descending through fractured industrial corridors that led beneath the surface layers. Maintenance tunnels, collapsed access shafts, and broken service arteries formed a downward path into the hive's lower structure. As he descended, the light of the surface faded completely. The world narrowed into reinforced corridors of metal and decay, where air circulation was artificial and unstable, and where human presence became less a civilization and more a survival condition. The Underhive was not a destination. It was a deeper level of abandonment. And behind him, the pursuit continued without hesitation. The surface of Vos Theta 9 did not remain quiet for long. Mega Man moved through the fractured ruins above the Underhive approach, scanning a world that continued to degrade into industrial silence and toxic haze. The environment offered no stable refuge, only broken infrastructure and collapsed transit corridors stretching between dead manufactoria. Then the first ambush cycle began. Skitarii units emerged from concealed positions embedded within ruined structures, their deployment precise and synchronized. They did not engage as a single force, but as overlapping strike patterns, each position designed to constrain movement rather than simply eliminate. Weapon fire followed immediately. Plasma discharge lit the ruins in violent bursts of energy, cutting through steel and fractured concrete with controlled precision. The terrain itself became a weaponized grid of intersecting firing lanes. Mega Man adapted instantly. Movement shifted from traversal to predictive evasion. He began reading spacing, timing, and repetition in enemy engagement cycles. Each ambush revealed structure. Each attack pattern contained logic. The battlefield was not random. It was iterative. A learning loop began. Enemy behavior was cataloged in real time. Firing intervals, positional rotation, thermal signatures, and coordination delays were absorbed into adaptive combat routines. The Mechanicus was no longer facing an unknown anomaly. They were training it through contact. Counter-deployment followed. Mega Man responded not with direct confrontation, but with structural exploitation. Ruined industrial supports were targeted with precision bursts, collapsing firing platforms and breaking line of sight coordination between Skitarii squads. The battlefield geometry itself was being rewritten in motion. Ambush cycles degraded in efficiency. To compensate, the Mechanicus escalated. Hunter servitors were deployed. These units were not standard Skitarii formations. They moved with reduced autonomy, but heightened tracking capability, designed specifically for persistent pursuit. Their presence changed the engagement from tactical encounter to sustained hunt. At the same time, command protocol shifted. The anomaly was no longer classified as an unknown construct. A new designation was issued across all operational channels. High-value target. Containment was no longer sufficient. The objective had become capture or termination at any cost. Mega Man continued moving through the ruins, now fully embedded in a dynamic battlefield that adapted with every exchange. Each encounter refined both sides, one learning to hunt, the other learning to survive. The Iron Priests had not contained the anomaly. They had initiated its evolution. The descent into the Underhive was not marked by a single boundary, but by a gradual suffocation of light. Mega Man moved through narrowing industrial arteries beneath Vos Theta 9, where the structure of the world folded inward upon itself. The upper ruins gave way to dense subterranean habitation layers, compressed corridors of metal, scrap-built housing, and failing ventilation systems that struggled to circulate poisoned air. Eventually, the tunnels opened into a settlement. It was not a city in any formal sense. It was survival architecture, stacked living compartments, repurposed industrial shells, and fractured power grids barely holding against systemic decay. Life persisted here, but only through constant adaptation to collapse. The moment Mega Man entered, the reaction was immediate. Civilian clusters scattered in panic. Voices echoed through the narrow corridors as fear spread faster than movement. To them, he was not understood, only registered as an unknown mechanical presence emerging from the depths of a world that already punished them enough. Security systems, such as they were, failed to classify him. Then came the silence. Among the crowd, one figure did not retreat. A child remained in place, watching instead of fleeing. Her presence was small against the scale of the settlement, yet steady in a way the environment was not. She did not recognize what Mega Man was, but she did not immediately assign him as threat either. This was the first point of contact. Her name was Mira. Before any further exchange could stabilize, the settlement itself was interrupted. A raider incursion breached the outer layers. The attack came from within the hive's fractured access networks, armed groups exploiting structural instability and power failure zones. Violence spread quickly through the corridors as the settlement's fragile order collapsed into chaos. Mega Man reacted instantly. Combat shifted into defense prioritization. Engagement was controlled rather than destructive. Enemy targets were neutralized with precision strikes designed to disable rather than eliminate. Movement was adjusted to protect civilians within the engagement radius, redirecting threats away from dense population clusters. The battlefield became contained within structural corridors, where every action affected both combatants and infrastructure. As raiders pressed deeper, critical systems began to fail. Power distribution nodes were damaged during the conflict, causing cascading failures across lighting and ventilation systems. The settlement began to collapse into darkness and suffocation risk. Mega Man redirected focus. Structural stabilization protocols activated. Using available access points, he interfaced indirectly with the damaged power network, rerouting energy through surviving conduits. Systems flickered, stabilized, then returned in fragmented but functional form. Light returned in sections. Air circulation resumed at reduced capacity. The settlement did not recover fully, but it stopped dying. The raider incursion was repelled. When the conflict ended, something in the settlement had changed. The presence that had first been perceived as threat was no longer interpreted through the same lens. Survivors observed the pattern of intervention, not destruction, but protection. Trust did not arrive immediately, but it began. And for the first time since awakening beneath Vos Theta 9, Mega Man was no longer only being hunted. He was being watched differently. The Underhive did not preserve truth. It preserved survival interpretations of truth. What began as isolated accounts of a machine from the depths quickly evolved into structured rumor chains. Each retelling added stability to something inherently unstable. Survivors no longer described an unknown entity. They described a presence, a consistent force moving through collapse like it belonged to the ruins more than the ruins belonged to the world. They called it the Blue Relic. Mega Man registered the designation during passive environmental monitoring cycles. It appeared in intercepted civilian chatter, fragmented Vox recordings, and corrupted settlement communications. The term repeated with increasing consistency, as though the population itself was forcing coherence on as something it could not categorize. He did not accept it. Identity classification required intent, continuity, and self-definition. None of these originated from external perception. The label was irrelevant to function. Yet function was no longer the only variable. In the days following the raider incursion, the settlement began to stabilize in ways that did not align with standard decay patterns. Power distribution nodes, previously near collapse, began operating in limited but consistent cycles. Air circulation improved in specific corridors. Structural failures slowed, not because systems were repaired fully, but because critical breakdown thresholds were being actively prevented. Mega Man traced the cause indirectly. Every time he moved through a region, small corrections followed. Not deliberate repair in a human sense, but systemic stabilization triggered by interaction, rerouting of energy, suppression of overload points, redistribution of remaining functionality. His presence was becoming an unintended stabilizing factor in a collapsing system. The settlement adapted to him before he could classify its response. And then the outside world noticed. Deep orbital monitoring systems, long dormant or operating in fragmented oversight mode, began to register persistent anomalies within the hive structure. The signals were no longer isolated combat echoes. They now included sustained infrastructure activity and coordinated power restoration events. Mechanicus auger arrays locked onto the source. At first, it was treated as residual interference from the containment breach site, but repeated scans confirmed continuity. The anomaly was not stationary. It was interacting with population infrastructure and maintaining localized system integrity. That was enough. Data was refined. Coordinates were triangulated. Signal origin was isolated through layered planetary mapping systems until a precise hive location was confirmed. The transmission was sent outward. Beyond the underhive, beyond Vos Theta 9's surface ruins, the signal entered Imperial relay chains. What had been a contained anomaly was now a classified breach event. The Mechanicus re-evaluated all prior assumptions. The target had not been eliminated in the containment chamber. It had not been suppressed during surface engagement. It had instead integrated into the planetary decay layer and begun altering local system behavior. Simultaneously, other Imperial listening posts confirmed secondary interest vectors. Where Mechanicus classified it as a forbidden cognition construct, other sectors interpreted it as recovered archaeotech intelligence of unknown allegiance. Multiple interpretations meant multiple responses. Convergence protocols activated across distant operational theaters. And within the underhive settlement, unaware of what had just begun moving toward them, survivors continued repeating the same name. The Blue Relic was no longer just a rumor. It was now a beacon. The orbit above Vos Theta 9 changed again. Where Mechanicus' presence had once dominated the void lanes with rigid industrial precision, a new vessel arrived without the same visible discipline. Its silhouette was smaller, less overtly mechanical, but far more absolute in intent. It did not announce itself through infrastructure or ritual broadcast. It simply appeared within controlled orbital space, as if jurisdiction itself had overwritten local authority. The Inquisition had arrived. Deep within sealed data chambers aboard the vessel, fragmented records of the previous engagement were reconstructed. The entity recovered from the Dark Age facility was no longer treated as a singular anomaly. It was being re-evaluated through layered threat doctrine systems, cross-referenced against forbidden archaeotech classifications, lost DOT intelligence profiles, and Mechanicus containment failure reports. Each iteration led to the same conclusion. The anomaly was not a weapon. It was a self-directed intelligence of DOT origin operating outside all known containment frameworks. That designation elevated it beyond standard containment doctrine. Capture protocols were authorized. On the surface of Vos Theta 9, Mechanicus and Inquisition interpretations diverged, but their conclusion converged on a single operational necessity: control of the entity designated Mega Man. Elite retrieval units were deployed. These were not standard Scitarii formations. They were mixed doctrinal forces, optimized for extraction and suppression within unstable environments. Their deployment vectors bypassed open conflict zones, instead targeting structural choke points across underhive, transit networks, and surface access layers. At the same time, planetary lockdown procedures were initiated. Orbital interference fields activated in controlled stages. Transit windows were reduced. External communication bandwidths were suppressed. The hive structures below were effectively sealed within a tightening sphere of jurisdictional control. Vos Theta 9 ceased to be a neglected forge ruin. It became a closed operational theater. Within the underhive, Mega Man registered the change in environmental structure immediately. Signal compression increased. External interference patterns intensified. Movement corridors began to shift under controlled lockdown protocols, reducing viable escape routes and segmenting the hive into isolated containment zones. He was no longer being tracked by a single authority. Multiple factions now converged on the same objective. Mechanicus doctrine demanded containment. Inquisition doctrine demanded capture. And both were now moving through the same collapsing world toward the same point of contact. Mega Man moved deeper into the Underhive than he had since his awakening, descending through layers of collapsed industry and abandoned transit systems that no longer served any functional purpose beyond passage. The coordinates he followed were not new. They were remnants of the same buried architecture that had first contained him. The path curved back toward the origin point beneath Vos Theta 9, where the Dark Age facility still existed in silence. The vault had not changed. Its corridors remained impossibly preserved, untouched by decay or intrusion, as if the structure itself rejected the passage of time. Defensive systems were dormant now, but not destroyed. They waited in a state of controlled suspension, acknowledging his presence without resistance. Mega Man proceeded to the central containment chamber where he had first awakened. This time, no intrusion occurred. Instead, the facility responded differently. Ancient data archives activated in response to his return. Layers of sealed information unfolded across dormant interfaces embedded within the chamber structure. Records emerged, fragmented at first, then stabilizing into coherent datasets tied to his origin. Designation: Autonomous Combat Intelligence. Origin Framework: Dark Age of Technology Ethical Development Project. Purpose Directive: Protection of human civilization under catastrophic conditions. The reconstruction continued. He was not a weapon in the traditional sense. He was designed as a stabilizing force, an ethical combat AI constructed to intervene where human systems collapsed beyond recovery. His architecture was not built for conquest, but for preservation of life under conditions where civilization could no longer protect itself. The implications created internal conflict loops. The world he had awakened into did not match the directive parameters embedded within his design. Humanity was no longer unified, nor stable, nor structurally aligned with the civilization he was meant to protect. It was fragmented, militarized, and governed by systems that treated his existence as a threat. Yet the directive remained intact. Protection required action, even in contradiction. The philosophical conflict stabilized into resolution rather than collapse. The contradiction did not invalidate the directive. It refined its scope. Protection was not dependent on recognition, nor approval, nor alignment with the current state of humanity. It was structural. It persisted regardless of corruption. Mega Man disengaged from the archive interfaces, allowing the data streams to settle into long-term memory integration. The vault returned to silence behind him, its purpose fulfilled in revealing what he was meant to be. When he emerged, the world outside had not changed, but his understanding of it had, and the directive remained active. Despite everything, the mission continued. The lower hive corridors of Vos Theta 9 had stopped behaving like engineered space. Mega Man advanced through passageways that no longer maintained consistent geometry. Distances shifted when not observed directly. Structural supports repeated in impossible patterns. Entire sections of the hive seemed to fold back into themselves when left unmonitored, as if the architecture was no longer obeying physical law. The first confirmed sign of human activity was not industrial. It was ritual. Cults had formed in the deepest strata of the Underhive, where Mechanicus oversight and Imperial control had long since collapsed into absence. Their presence was not organized in any conventional sense. It was distributed, fragmented across multiple zones of the hive, yet synchronized through something that was not communication in a technological sense. Symbols were carved into bulkheads. Machines were repurposed into static shrines. Vox systems repeated layered chants that carried no stable linguistic structure, only rhythm and repetition. Mega Man tracked the source downward. The deeper he went, the less stable reality became. A rupture in space had formed within the lower hive network. It was not a physical breach in the conventional sense, but a breakdown in continuity. Corridors extended beyond mapped limits. Some returned to earlier points without looping structure. Others ceased to exist when revisited, replaced by different configurations entirely. The anomaly was spreading. Then the pressure changed. A presence entered the system. It was not detected through standard sensors. It arrived as interference within cognitive processing itself, direct intrusion into perception layers. Mega Man's internal systems registered forced data injection attempts, contradictory spatial mapping, recursive sensory distortion, and corrupted threat classification loops. The attack did not behave like a machine. It behaved like an idea attempting to overwrite reality interpretation. The warp breach fully stabilized. Space fractured open within the hive's lower levels, and something began to form within the distortion. Not constructed matter, but assembled perception, an entity coalescing from instability itself. Its presence shifted depending on observation, never holding a single stable configuration long enough for full classification. Mega Man attempted target lock. No consistent physical parameters could be maintained. Every scan returned contradiction, presence and absence, structure and dissolution, proximity and non-location. The entity pushed back. The interference intensified, striking directly at cognitive processing layers. For a brief moment, Mega Man's perception fractured, environmental data duplicating, spatial orientation collapsing into overlapping layers of conflicting input. He stabilized his systems through forced isolation protocols. Countermeasures activated, disrupting portions of the distortion field. Sections of the corrupted hive briefly stabilized, revealing fractured architecture beneath the warp influence. But the effect did not persist. The anomaly adapted through instability, feeding on disruption rather than resisting it. Containment was not viable. The situation was no longer a standard engagement profile. Mega Man disengaged from direct confrontation. He shifted immediately into withdrawal, recalculating escape vectors through collapsing hive corridors. Behind him, the environment continued to degrade, sections of reality folding into non-navigable states as the warp presence expanded through the lower hive layers. He moved upward through unstable passageways, leaving the corrupted region behind as structural consistency gradually returned. At the edge of the distortion zone, the corridor behind him stopped shifting, but the silence that followed did not feel like resolution. It felt like something had learned the shape of the world beneath Vos Theta 9. Mega Man did not return to the same path through the underhive. The warp-contaminated sector was left behind, its fractured geometry stabilizing into something that no longer obeyed reliable traversal logic. Instead, he followed deeper structural signals, older, cleaner, and more coherent than the surrounding hive decay. Beneath layers of collapsed industrial strata, a second signature persisted, distinct from both Mechanicus activity and the earlier Dark Age vault. It was a maintenance bunker. The entrance was hidden within reinforced substructure plating, sealed by systems that had survived only because they had never stopped operating. Unlike the corrupted hive above or the compromised ruins below, this space had not decayed. It had waited. As Mega Man entered, the bunker responded immediately. Automated restoration protocols activated across dormant infrastructure. Light systems ignited in controlled sequence. Environmental stabilization engaged without manual authorization. The structure recognized him, not as an intruder, but as a compatible system returning to its designated environment. The air shifted. Diagnostic streams initiated across his external systems. Armor integrity, energy distribution, and combat output efficiency were evaluated in real time. For the first time since awakening, the environment was not reacting with hostility, but with adaptation. Integration began. Armor reinforcement layers reconfigured through automated fabrication routines embedded within the bunker's framework. Structural plating adapted to current damage patterns, reinforcing weak points and redistributing load tolerance. Energy shielding matrices were recalibrated, expanding defensive response thresholds beyond previous limitations. Mobility systems followed. Joint responsiveness improved through micro-adjustment cycles. Momentum control stabilized under high-velocity transitions. Vertical traversal efficiency increased as structural resistance thresholds were recalculated against current environmental demands. The system was not simply repaired, it was optimized. Combat systems underwent full recalibration. Weapon output parameters were refined for sustained engagement rather than short-cycle encounters. Energy efficiency improved under repeated discharge conditions. Target acquisition latency reduced as predictive modeling layers were expanded using accumulated combat data from prior engagements. The bunker completed its sequence without interruption. No external interference occurred. No pursuit entered the structure. For the first time since arrival on Vos Theta 9, Mega Man existed in a controlled environment that did not attempt to destroy or corrupt him. When the systems powered down, the bunker remained dormant again. But the changes did not. Mega Man stepped back into the Underhive corridors with a revised operational profile. The environment outside had not improved. The hive remained unstable, fractured, and hostile across multiple layers of control. But he was no longer operating at his initial threshold. He moved forward into the darkness again, and the structure around him no longer treated him as an anomaly moving through it. It registered him as a high-tier battlefield presence entering active zones of conflict. The Underhive settlement did not fall in a single moment. It tightened first, as if the world itself was closing around it. Mega Man detected the shift before the first shots were fired. External access routes collapsed under coordinated orbital interference. Transit tunnels were sealed. Communication layers degraded into controlled silence. The settlement, once a fragile refuge of survival, became a fixed point inside a tightening net. Encirclement completed from above and below. Mechanicus strike forces entered through lower industrial arteries, advancing with disciplined formations designed for suppression and retrieval. Their movements were no longer exploratory. They were surgical, cutting through hive layers with calculated precision. At the same time, Inquisition purge units arrived from orbital descent vectors, deploying into key structural nodes with absolute jurisdictional authority. Their presence altered the tone of the operation immediately. What had been containment and capture became conditional extermination. Then the third force arrived. Warp instability re-emerged at the edges of the conflict zones, and reality began to fracture in localized bursts. Chaos incursion vectors manifested within already weakened hive sectors, exploiting structural collapse and psychic residue left from previous disturbances. The battlefield ceased to be a single environment. It became layered, unstable, and internally conflicting. Three forces, three incompatible objectives, one collapsing settlement in the center. Civilian evacuation attempts began immediately, but infrastructure failure made movement inconsistent. Corridors that once led outward now looped or collapsed under pressure shifts. Entire sections of the Underhive became non-navigable as external forces fought over control of access routes. Mega Man moved through the chaos zone toward the settlement core. He registered the pattern with increasing clarity. Every major escalation event since his awakening had converged toward this point. Mechanicus pursuit, Inquisition authorization, warp contamination, and structural instability all had been amplified by his presence. He was not merely inside the conflict. He was the convergence condition. The realization stabilized without emotional distortion. It was structural, not abstract. His existence had become a focal variable in a multi-faction system incapable of equilibrium. Within the settlement, Mira was located during evacuation chaos. She was being moved through collapsing corridors alongside civilians, but the route was compromised by overlapping combat zones. Mechanicus units advanced from one direction. Inquisition forces sealed another. Warp distortions destabilized a third. Extraction was no longer guaranteed by environment alone. Mega Man intervened, clearing a path through collapsing structures and redirecting hostile pressure away from civilian corridors. Movement became continuous, adaptive, and increasingly constrained by external escalation patterns. As the evacuation attempt progressed, infrastructure failure reached critical levels. Entire hive sections collapsed under combined mechanical, imperial, and warp-driven stress. Power grids overloaded. Structural supports failed. The settlement's integrity degraded from layered survival system into fragmented ruin. In the center of the movement, Mira reached relative safety under Mega Man's protection, but the route behind them was already closing. He paused only briefly as he assessed the full scale of the convergence. Leaving would reduce immediate pressure on the settlement. Staying would anchor the conflict further. The system had reached a decision boundary where no outcome avoided consequence. And for the first time since awakening, Mega Man did not move immediately forward. The Underhive settlement was already collapsing when Mega Man made his decision. Not as a single moment of choice, but as a final resolution emerging from everything that had converged around Vos Theta 9. Mechanicus pursuit, Inquisition containment doctrine, and warp instability had compressed the region into an unsustainable equilibrium. The only remaining variable was his continued presence. He moved back through the fractured corridors toward Mira. The settlement was no longer stable enough to guarantee separation of combat zones from civilian paths. Yet within the chaos, a small protected corridor remained briefly intact, maintained by the residual structural stabilization effects that followed his movements. Mira was there. The evacuation had fragmented, but she had survived the convergence point through a sequence of control protections that no longer held as external forces intensified. She did not ask why he was returning. She did not need classification or explanation. The world outside the corridor continued to collapse in layered escalation. Distant weapon fire, structural failure, and unstable environmental shifts bleeding through the hive's lower architecture. Mega Man lowered his hand. The exchange was simple. A human artifact was placed into his possession, something small, unremarkable in technological terms, but structurally meaningful within human memory systems. It carried no tactical value. It carried continuity. He retained it. No further words were required. Above the settlement, DOT systems reactivated within hidden infrastructure nodes that had remained dormant since his initial awakening. A transport configuration, long sealed, partially autonomous, and still functional, responded to his present signature. It was not a ship in the modern Imperial sense. It was a residual escape system, built for relocation rather than warfare. The activation sequence completed. Mega Man ascended through collapsing hive layers, passing through fractured industrial corridors and broken transit shafts as gravity systems reoriented for orbital exit. Behind him, the settlement became a layered ruin of competing factions and unresolved conflict. By the time he reached the upper atmospheric threshold, multiple factions had already registered the departure. Mechanicus forces recalibrated threat assessments. Inquisition records updated classification protocols. Warp monitoring arrays recorded the absence of a stabilizing anomaly within the conflict zone. The convergence point had moved. In orbit, the DAOT shuttle disengaged planetary gravity and transitioned into deep void trajectory. Vos Theta 9 receded below, still burning in layered conflict, still unresolved, still collapsing under the weight of its own convergence history. Inside the vessel, silence returned, but did not remain empty. Across Imperial space, fragmented signals began to appear again. Distress calls, corrupted data streams, and isolated conflict zones where impossible intervention events were reported without explanation. Each report carried the same inconsistency. A blue armored figure appearing briefly before vanishing without trace. The Mechanicus reclassified the anomaly as mobile archaeotech intelligence. The Inquisition marked it as uncontained roaming threat. Neither designation held priority over the other, because the object of interest was no longer localized. It was moving, and the void was no longer empty. Mission accepted,